Hi, everybody!
The cinematic video game is not entirely a new phenomenon. They've been around since the early 90s if you include cinematic platformers in the discussion. If you exclude those, they've been around since the mid-90s to early 2000s. The PS1 is probably the earliest example of cinematic gaming. You had games like the Oddworld titles, which were platformers, then you had large-scale RPGs like your Final Fantasies, etc. Now let me be clear, I don't hate cinematic video games. It's just in recent years, that's all Sony have really put out, and I'm getting a bit bored of them. And it seems like the general gaming public is as well. But why are cinematic video games becoming so boring? While Sony is probably the biggest offender for this, it's not just an issue with their games. Basically, any big-budget AAA level video game is trying to be a fucking movie at this point. Very few video games can get away with this. Most of Hideo Kojima's games can get away with it because Kojima actually tells an interesting narrative within his games. But cinematic games are so prevalent now that it's as bad as the MCU is for cinema. We don't need another fucking superhero film every week. Just like we don't need continuous cinematic video games. Because guess what? They're supposed to be games first.
Tell me when I'm telling lies!
And you see, this is where some developers, not all, but some developers have lost their way. You see, what developers, some of them anyway, are tending to focus on these days is making 20 to 100 hour movies that just so happen to have gameplay within them, as opposed to making a good video game. As someone who is very gameplay focused, this really annoys the hell out of me. I cannot stand it when I see a 7-hour to 8-hour cinematic cutscene fest of a game, and then you have generic gameplay just, kind of sprinkled in just to say, hey, you interacted with it. Hey, see, this is a game, see, there's gameplay. Yeah, fuck that shit.
Which is something a lot of game developers seem to have forgotten. If your game is more cutscene than gameplay, make a movie at that point. Obviously, some games need to focus more on the story, but those are typically RPGs. They're at minimum going to be 40-hour experiences. Those games require cutscenes to tell the narrative, but they have long stretches of gameplay. Most cinematic games don't. Now, it's one thing if you have a game that plays great and has a fun and addicting gameplay loop that keeps the player coming back for more. It's another when you have weaker gameplay that's also shallow. It's these games that are especially bad for it. The more recent God of War games, for example, aren't as good on the gameplay front as the ones on the PS2 and PS3. They are by no means bad games, but their more simplistic combat gets boring quickly. Also, The Last of Us is really not all that deep in terms of gameplay. The first game had an addictive loop at the time because of the hidden secrets, really nice visuals, and the basic crafting system that appeals to the loot gremlin in all of us. But that gameplay didn't hold up once the second game released in 2020. It proved that the game was really basic at its core. Now, basic games can be great. Look at the Crash Bandicoot series. Those games are as simple as it gets. You have a couple of buttons and a very defined goal. But it's actually fun to play because you can always play more efficiently. You can die fewer times, you can cut off seconds from your time if you try to speedrun the levels. Hence why time trials were added to the Insane Trilogy. For those that don't know, Crash 3 was the first game to feature the time trials in the series. So basic is in no way a bad thing. Basic just has to be presented in a fun package. But that's the problem. A lot of these cinematic games have gameplay that is objectively boring. Walking simulators have a place. As tech showcases. That's it. Otherwise, they're a slog to play and to watch.
Tell me when I'm telling lies!
I know that it says in the script I'm not supposed to cut in here, I'm supposed to pull up some text, but I actually think that one's necessary here because a text pop-up cannot do this point justice that I'm about to make here. And that is, yes, these games can be a slog to watch if you're going for just no commentary type of deal. Now, if you watch some of these games for like trophy hunting reasons. If you're a PlayStation gamer or if you're an Xbox gamer and you're looking for some achievements, that can be a way to watch it. Also, if you watch a playthrough on YouTube and the creator that you're watching enhances the experience, that's another way that you can reasonably do this. And so yeah, it really all comes down to the creator that you're watching, or if you decide to go commentary or no commentary and things like that. There's multiple factors that can really key in to how your experience watching a playthrough on YouTube goes. So yeah, I just figured I'd come in and say that.
So a lot of them are just walking sims with some cutscenes. I just don't understand the fascination with the vast majority of simulation games. Back in the day, I enjoyed games like Roller Coaster Tycoon, SimCity 4, and a few others. But things like walking sims or games that simulate actual jobs you could be paid for just don't make sense to me. But that's beside the point. So getting back to the topic at hand, a lot of these games tend to play in a rather homogenized way. Homogenization can be a good thing in gaming when done in moderation. It's because of this we're seeing controls become more standardized. That standardization has made it easier for people to actually get into gaming, which is a good thing, for the most part. It makes it easier to pick up one game than switch to another. You still get games that do controls their own unique ways, of course, but those are becoming fewer and fewer. But circling back to cinematic games, the vast majority of them go for a third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective. So the homogenized controls and the constant use of third-person, over-the-shoulder cameras, combined with the games all playing in a similar manner with an emphasis on movie-like cutscenes and storytelling, means they kind of all blend together. This kind of becomes a trend in gaming. Some developers find something that works and performs well commercially, then every developer under the sun tries to copy that formula. This then repeats until the market is oversaturated. This is of course mostly a problem in the AAA space. Indies don't have this issue, as they're usually passion projects for the teams involved, so you'll find far more diversity there. So that begs the question, can cinematic video games be saved? I think they can be. They might just have to go away for a long while. They'd also need to come back with fresh ideas and fresh presentation. Basically, they'd have to be gamified again. Out of all of the cinematic video games, I'd say Uncharted is the franchise that has managed to do it the best. Same for the Infamous games. They weren't just cinematic for the sake of being cinematic. Well, okay, Uncharted was, but it had a reason to be, since it was trying to mimic the feel of popcorn flicks from the 1980s. Infamous, on the other hand, was cinematic because it actually enhanced the gameplay. I've previously covered in another video why the Infamous series should come back. A card will be popping up now, and a link will be in the pinned comment. So if that video sounds interesting to you, or you've enjoyed this one so far, why not consider hitting the subscribe button. Other ways this type of game could be saved is if they simply diversified which games got the cinematic treatment. Platformers definitely work, RPGs certainly do as well. Even some first-person shooters like the Resistance series benefit from this. Also, games like Heavy Rain and Detroit Become Human certainly work for cinematic direction. But there's a finite number of times you can draw from those wells, and the death of the cinematic game is nigh.
Yeah, and I don't think it's anytime soon. I'd say give it anywhere from about 3 to 4 years from now, and I think we'll start to see more and more and more people just be like, yeah, okay, we've been here before, game devs. It's time to stop. It's time to stop. But we're not at that point just yet. It's gonna take a little bit.
So I've pronounced the doom on the cinematic video game. When do I think it'll die off? I think within the next 2 to 3 years. More and more video game companies are saying the current business model does not work, and are actively saying the industry needs to turn to more AA type experiences. Insomniac Games is the biggest one stating that. We're still in a phase where more cinematic games are wrapping up production and smaller experiences have yet to be developed. Since your typical AAA game takes 3 to 5 years to develop, I'd say we're about 3 years out from companies having more AA styled games in the pipeline and ready to release. I imagine a lot of these types of games will get announced at upcoming Nintendo Directs, PlayStation States of Play or showcases, Summer Games Fest, Xbox events, and the Game Awards. If you've liked the video so far, hit the like button. But getting back to the death of the cinematic game, it's not going to die off completely. But burnout is setting in, and companies are shifting over to smaller scale projects. So clearly, over the next few years, we're going to see fewer and fewer cinematic games. It's just a matter of time. So what are some of your favorite cinematic video games of all time? Do you think the genre is dying? Sound off in the comments. Thanks go out to my current channel members, Art Campbell and Danny Boy. If you'd like to help the channel out further, you can do so by hitting the join button or the link in the description. Want more talk of games that work as cinematic experiences? Why not check out my video on why the Resistance series should return? Or if Infamous is more your thing, check out how Infamous could come back. Until next time, keep blazing that trail.